W5.
We're facing one of the most historic moments in American history.
A president on trial.
Was there a quid pro quo? The answer is yes.
You're going to impeach and remove a president for this.
I want nothing. I want nothing.
And searching for the lost.
You feel like you need to bring these people home.
We have to.
Not knowing just eats you alive.
You're worried that they're going to mess up your cases.
There is a potential.
Eventually, somebody will find her.
CTV's W5 with Richard Madan, Sandy Ronaldo, and Avery Hames. Here is Sandy Ronaldo.
Welcome to W5. U.S. President Donald Trump now faces almost certain impeachment and a trial in the Senate for so-called high crimes and misdemeanors, the most serious charges of bribery, as Trump tried to get the government of Ukraine to investigate a political opponent in exchange for military aid. As Richard Madan explains, at the center of it all, 2 phone calls that define the case against Donald Trump.
Committee will come to order in the impeachment inquiry into Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States.
An extraordinary moment in U.S. history. Congress is taking the rare step of investigating whether or not the president should be impeached and removed from office. Democrats accuse Donald Trump of abusing the power of his office for personal gain by pressuring Ukraine's leader, Vladimir Zelensky, to dig up dirt on his political rival in exchange for military aid and a trip to the White House.
Quote, I have complete power. No, you don't, Donald Trump.
Call transcripts show Trump demanded a public inquiry into former Vice President Joe Biden and Ukrainian energy company Burisma that employed Biden's son Hunter. Simply put, get Ukraine to announce a probe into the Bidens in exchange for crucial security assistance and a face-to-face at the White House. That's the alleged quid pro quo.
I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo.
Democrat Adam Schiff is spearheading the inquiry and doesn't believe Trump's defense.
Is this what Americans should now expect from their president? If this is not impeachable conduct, what is?
But he was fought at every turn by Republican members of Congress like Devin Nunes.
This impeachment is not helping the American people. It's not a legitimate use of taxpayer dollars, and it's definitely not improving our national security.
Well, we're facing one of the most historic moments in American history. We've never had an impeachment, at least in the modern era, during a president's first term where he's also facing an election. How this turns out will, I think, resonate down the annals of American history for the next 50 years.
And Paul Rosenzweig should know he was senior counsel to Special Prosecutor Ken Starr during the impeachment hearings involving then-President Bill Clinton.
Let's think back, though. Back in the 90s, when the Clinton impeachment snowball was picking up steam, what were you thinking then, and contrast to what you're thinking now?
I think the impeachment against Trump is much more significant than the
Why
Clinton impeachment. Well, first, because Clinton's underlying activity involved his personal behavior. Here, the underlying activity of what President Trump is doing involves his behavior as president, his professional behavior, if you will, his official behavior. And misuse of official authority strikes much more at the core of the concerns that the framers had about authoritarian government and abuse of presidential authority.
Over the course of 9 days in late November, the committee would hear from 12 witnesses, most distinguished career diplomats, like Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, a decorated military veteran and a member of the National Security Council specializing in Ukraine. The focus of much of the testimony would surround a pair of phone calls. The first on July 25th, 2019.
On July 25th, 2019, the call occurred. I listened on the call in the Situation Room with White House colleagues. I was concerned by the call. What I heard was inappropriate.
This is a military officer who's dedicated his career to working on Ukraine, Russian affairs, and he's listening to this call, and immediately he says, there is something wrong here.
Brett Bruin is a former U.S. diplomat who served as the director of global engagement under President Barack Obama.
It is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent.
He was on that call. He was the person who prepared all of the materials, who knew what the president was supposed to say, who knew what the reaction by the president of Ukraine, by political actors in that country would be if the president pressed him for political favors. So he is actually the person best placed to speak to this point about the potential abuse of power, because he knows what is being abused.
Jennifer Williams, a special advisor to Vice President Mike Pence, was also on that call.
During my closed-door deposition, members of the committee asked about my personal views and whether I had any concerns about the July 25th call. As I testified then, I found the July 25th phone call unusual because, in contrast to other presidential calls I had observed, it involved discussion of what appeared to be a domestic political matter.
Jennifer and I go back several years. We went through training together. We've stayed in touch. You know, the irony is she's one of the more conservative members of the diplomatic corps. She worked for the Bush-Cheney campaign back in her time before becoming a diplomat.
Also listening from the Situation Room was Tim Morrison, a staunch Republican and former top advisor to President Trump on Europe.
I feared at the time of the call on July 25th how its disclosure would play in Washington's political climate. My fears have been realized.
Overall, did the witnesses come across as credible?
The witnesses in the impeachment hearing were very credible. All of them came across as dedicated public servants who were testifying not because they wanted to, but because they felt a need or an obligation to the rule of law and to American norms.
A partial transcript of the call shows President Trump asking for a favor and that the Ukrainian president look into a widely debunked conspiracy theory alleging Ukraine, not Russia, meddled in the 2016 election through a software company called CrowdStrike.
Now, I want to show a couple of excerpts from this call record to each of you. The first is President Trump responding to a comment by President Zelensky related to defense support from the United States and the purchase of javelins. And President Trump then says, I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot, and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people, the server. They say Ukraine has it. Now, Mr. Morrison, were these references to CrowdStrike, the server, were they included in the president's talking points?
They were not.
And were they consistent with what you understood at that time to be official U.S. policy?
I was not aware of much of this at the time.
But you would agree, right, that asking a foreign government to investigate a domestic political rival is inappropriate, would you not?
It's not what we recommended the president discuss.
Let's go to another excerpt from this call where President Trump asked President Zelensky to investigate his political opponent, Vice President Joe Biden. Here, President Trump says, the other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into it. It sounds horrible to me, he said. Now, are you aware of any credible allegations or evidence to support this notion that Vice President Biden did something wrong or against U.S. policy with regard to Ukraine?
I am not.
Ms. Williams, are you familiar with any credible evidence to support this theory against Vice President Biden?
No, I'm not.
Colonel Vindman, you said in your deposition that it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see the political benefits of the president's demands. For those of us who are not rocket scientists, can you explain what you meant by that?
So my understanding is that it was the connection to investigate into a political opponent was inappropriate and improper. I made that connection as soon as the president brought up the Biden investigation.
But did that mean quid pro quo? Well, few could be in a better position to know than Ambassador Gordon Sondland, even though he didn't learn about the contents of the call until months later.
I was not on the call, and I don't think I was invited to be on the call. In fact, I first read the transcript on September 25th, the day it was publicly released. All I had heard at that time was that the call had gone well.
A lifelong Republican, Sondland donated $1 million to the Trump inauguration and was subsequently named ambassador to the European Union.
Sondland knows how these games are played. And that's also, I think, an important point, where Sondland can speak very directly as a businessman who is cut from the same cloth as Donald Trump, who knows how these negotiations work. He's bringing that business negotiation mentality into diplomacy, and he's saying, yeah, I know what Donald Trump wants. Let me go out and get it for him.
I know that members of this committee frequently frame these complicated issues in the form of a simple question. Was there a quid pro quo? As I testified previously, with regard to the requested White House call and the White House meeting, the answer is yes. President Trump wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing to investigations of Burisma and the 2016 election. We all understood that these prerequisites for the White House call and the White House meeting reflected President Trump's desires and requirements.
So you agree that the president should not be allowed to ask for the investigation of a political rival?
In the context of what was going on in Ukraine, I believe that the president should not investigate a political rival in return for a quid pro quo.
As to the Ukrainian quid pro quo, or I think a better way to phrase it is bribery. It was a demand by the president for a thing of value in exchange for the performance of his official duties, which is the exact definition of bribery. It isn't a defense to the idea of quid pro quo that the president never said the words quid pro quo. He said, I want you to do me a favor. He said, I want this to happen. He said, that's what we need to happen. And then, of course, he said, I want them to do the right thing. So that's like me telling you, I want you to get rid of this guy, but don't do anything bad while you get rid of him. Everybody knows that the second part is for the microphones.
So in your mind, how damning was Sondland's testimony?
Sondland's testimony was pretty darn damning. I think Sondland put a nail in the coffin of Republican attempts to sweep this issue under the rug.
So this is more than theatrics. This is a big deal.
We have in this whole affair an illustration of how the president does business. We didn't have that before. We didn't have the same inside view, pull back the curtain, see how the sausage is made.
And now we do.
And it is not a pretty picture.
Coming up.
The president's voice was loud and recognizable.
Insiders turn on Trump.
So there's a good case for impeachment here.
When W5 continues.
Committee will come to order. Today's witnesses are here because they were subpoenaed to appear, not because they are for or against impeachment. That question is for Congress.
Was President Donald Trump guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors, bribery, abuse of power? These historic hearings would lay out the case.
I sincerely hope the Democrats end this affair as quickly as possible so our nation can begin to heal the many wounds it has inflicted on us.
But any possible national healing would have to wait, as the impeachment inquiry would turn its attention to a second key phone call on July 26, this time between Trump and Ambassador Gordon Sondland.
I am nonpartisan and have been appointed to my positions by
by every president from President Reagan to President Trump.
Ambassador Taylor.
Ambassador William Taylor is a decorated Vietnam veteran with more than 40 years of high-level diplomatic experience.
Last Friday, a member of my staff told me of events that occurred on July 26th. In the presence of my staff, at a restaurant, Ambassador Sondland called President Trump and told him of his meetings in Kyiv. The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations. Ambassador Sondland told President Trump the Ukrainians were ready to move forward. Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine.
That staff member who overheard the call was David Holmes, a Foreign Service officer stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine.
When the president came on, he sort of winced and held the phone away from his ear like this. And he did that for the first couple exchanges. While Ambassador Sondland's phone was not on speakerphone, I could hear the president's voice through the earpiece of the phone. The president's voice was loud and recognizable. And Ambassador Sondland held the phone away from his ear for a period of time, presumably because of the loud volume.
Yeah, he was kind of fun to watch, wasn't he? Holding the phone, miming the phone. You could hear it on the phone.
Paul Rosenzweig is a national security expert and was a senior counsel during the Clinton impeachment hearings.
The thing that he brings most is that he's the second witness to the Sondland call. Gordon Sondland originally didn't remember that call in great detail, which everybody suspects was a convenient failure of memory.
But when called to publicly testify, Ambassador Sondland's memory seemed pretty good.
The call lasted 5 minutes. I remember I was at a restaurant in Kyiv, and I have no reason to doubt that this conversation included the subject of investigations. We did not discuss any classified information. Other witnesses have recently shared their recollection of overhearing this call. For the most part, I have no reason to doubt their accounts. It's true that the president speaks loudly at times. It's true that the president likes to use colorful language. Anyone who has met with him at any reasonable amount of time knows this.
I then heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation. Ambassador Sondland replied that he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to do. Even though I did not take notes of these statements, I have a clear recollection that these statements were made.
The July 26 call did not strike me as significant at the time. Actually, I would have been more surprised if President Trump had not mentioned investigations. However, I have no recollection of discussing Vice President Biden or his son on that call or after the call ended.
After the call ended, Ambassador Sondland remarked that the president was in a bad mood. As Ambassador Sondland stated, it was often the case early in the morning. I then took the opportunity to ask Ambassador Sondland for his candid impression of the president's views on Ukraine.
What did Ambassador Sondland say to you?
He said he doesn't really care about Ukraine.
Did he use slightly more colorful language than that?
He did.
What did he say that he does care about?
He said he cares about big stuff.
Did he explain what he meant by big stuff?
Well, I asked him, well, what kind of big stuff? We have big stuff going on here, like a war with Russia, and he said, no, big stuff like the Biden investigation.
How do you have such a specific and clear recollection of this conversation with the president and your conversation with Ambassador Sondland?
Yeah. So this was a very distinctive experience. I've never seen anything like this in my Foreign Service career. Someone at a lunch in a restaurant making a call on a cell phone to the President of the United States. Being able to hear his voice, it's a very distinctive personality, as we've all seen on television. Very colorful language was used. They were directly addressing something that I had been wondering about, working on for weeks and even months, hearing the president's voice and them talking about this issue of the Biden investigation that I'd been hearing about.
Brett Bruin is a consultant and former high-ranking diplomat.
Did the Democrats effectively make their case to impeach the president?
I think they laid the foundation. They don't have to build the whole case in the first phase. This phase was about laying out the evidence, in my view, I think the Democrats did a fairly effective job at putting together the various elements of both an obstruction of justice charge as well as abuse of power.
But Republicans like Chris Stewart aren't convinced.
And I really think that for those who hate the president, they haven't changed their minds. But there's a lot of Americans who look at this and they think, is that it, really? You're going to impeach and remove a president for this. And yet, impeachment is almost inevitable.
I don't think anything is inevitable, but it certainly seems to me that the evidence that was put forward in the hearings makes out a good case for impeachment, and that if the House chooses to do so, it would not be disregarding the evidence. There's a good case for impeachment here.
What do you think the long-term impact of this impeachment inquiry is on the country?
It's difficult to say what the long-term impact will be until we know the end of the story. But I think if we don't impeach Donald Trump, or if we impeach him and don't remove him, and if he wins re-election, that will redefine what is acceptable behavior by the American president on the foreign stage. It will redefine what is acceptable for a president to do to secure his own re-election.
When the founders provided a mechanism in the Constitution for impeachment, they were worried about what might happen if someone unethical took the highest office in the land and used it for their personal gain. And in my view, there is nothing more dangerous than an unethical president who believes they are above the law. And I would just say to people watching here at home and around the world, in the words of my great colleague, we are better than that. Adjourned.
Donald Trump is only the fourth U.S. president to face formal impeachment proceedings. Previously, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton faced a trial in the Senate, but were acquitted and served out their elected terms. Richard Nixon chose to resign before he could be formally impeached by the full House of Representatives. We'll be right back.
Coming up,
these are the ones that really need more questions answered.
A decades-long hunt for clues.
Some of the stories were they put her in a septic system, they fed her to the pigs.
When W5 continues.